At number 10, we have zombies. So archaeologists in Sicily have discovered evidence that the zombie phenomenon is actually not a recent development. Research conducted over the past decade shows that the phenomenon actually dates back to over 2,000 years. The archaeologist Carrie Sulowski-Weaver analyzed 2 burials from a Greek settlement in Sicily that she believed were the remains of the revenants. Now, the ancient Greeks believed that certain dead bodies could reanimate, and to prevent them from leaving their burial sites, they needed to be ritually killed or confined by pinning them down with large stones or fragments of amphora. Number 9 has to do with payment for the afterlife. In Greek mythology, it was believed that individuals who passed away, they had to pay Charon, which is the ferryman of River Styx, to enter the underworld. Now, to ensure safe passage, people were actually buried with obol, which is a Greek coin worth 1/6 of a drachma, and that was placed in their mouth or near their body as payment for Charon's services. Those who were unable to pay that fare, they were believed to wander aimlessly along the shores of River Styx for a century before being allowed to cross. Ancient Greeks also had some very severe punishments, particularly involving adultery. Adultery was viewed as a very severe offense, as the Greeks believed that adultery had a direct impact on the family, which of course was highly valued in their ancient society. Now, if you were caught in the act, the guardian of that woman had the legal right to end the life of her. Alternatively though, if the case went to court, the accused would face punishment such as having a large radish inserted into their behind, yeah, like up there, and having their pubic hair removed with hot ash. Ouch! For number 7, the ancient Greeks also were very fascinated with improving their physical fitness and appearance, and during exercise, men would strip down and apply oil to their bodies and exercise without clothes on. And here's an interesting fact about this. The term gymnasium actually derives from the Greek word gymnasion, which translates to school for unclothed exercise. Interesting. Gymnasiums, they were highly valued and considered essential in every major city, with observing the bodies of the men working out being part of gym culture. That's just what men did, observe other men at the gym without clothes. And upon finishing their workout, men used a semicircular tool called a strigil to scrape off the oil and dead skin. And those scrapings could then be sold as elixirs to the public. Coming down to the number 6 spot, let's talk about male statues. Although ancient Greeks placed great value on muscular and masculine physiques for men, they had an opposite preference when it came to male private parts, and we see that in their statues. So Greek statues found in museums today depict men that are poorly endowed, since erect private parts were seen as a sign of stupidity. Okay. But smaller private parts, or at least private parts that were flaccid, meaning that they weren't hard, they were actually ones that were idolized, and they symbolized having great intelligence if they were small. Yeah. Coming in at number 5, let's talk about strange festivals back in ancient Greece. They celebrated festivals as a way to connect with the supernatural world through various activities and rituals. These festivals were characterized by unique and often bizarre traditions, including things like athletic events, sacrifices, as well as musical performances, and also large feasts. One of these festivals in particular was known as Scirophorion, which was the final month of the Athenian calendar. And during this time, Athenians would offer animal sacrifices to Zeus Polius on Acropolis. And although they typically avoided sacrificing oxen, this occasion was actually considered special enough to permit using them as sacrificial animals. Following the sacrifice, the sacrificer would stand trial, but would often shift the blame to the ox. As a result, the ox would be convicted and then drowned and then resurrected by stuffing it with straw. Well, resurrected. I use a term loosely, kind of like make it look like it's alive again. Number 4 leads us to weird contraception. In ancient Greece, women sought to prevent pregnancy by using olive and cedar oils that decreased the motility of their partner's seminal fluid, giving them more time to cleanse themselves after intercourse. To reduce the risk of conception, other contraceptive measures that were suggested by Greek gynecologists included sneezing. And as a matter of fact, one such gynecologist advised women to hold their breath and move away slightly to prevent the seminal fluid from being deposited too deeply inside of them. So when they backed away from their partner, what they would do afterwards would be to squat and induce sneezing, and this would expel any remaining fluid, and then they would thoroughly cleanse their lady parts. Coming in at number 3, this is an interesting one, tasting body fluids. In ancient Greece, medical practitioners believed that the human body was actually made up of different bodily fluids, each with a distinct taste and appearance. And to make an accurate diagnosis, doctors, they not only examined the patient's vomit and urine, but they would also taste the vomit and the urine. And in some cases, doctors would actually ask for urine samples, as healthy urine was believed to taste like fig juice. And any deviation from this taste was an indication of illness. Number 2 has to deal with ending infant life. Although taking the lives of infants was viewed as a heinous act and frowned upon in ancient Greece, well, exposure was a very common practice used to get rid of unwanted infants, particularly those with physical abnormalities, or in many cases, even female children. The act was not considered a crime though, since it was believed that the gods would intervene if they wanted to save the child. As you could imagine, typically the decision of whether to abandon the baby would fall on the patriarch of the family, and the ancient Greeks saw female infants as a financial burden because providing them with a dowry when they married would cost the family a lot. Also, since few job opportunities existed at that time for women, they were unlikely to contribute to the household income. Now, ending this episode off at number 1 is probably something that we would call predatory relationships, among other terms. Although we now consider preying on children to be a very reprehensible and unlawful act, the ancient Greeks not only engage in these type of relations with young boys, but they also celebrated them. Relationships between an adult man and a boy just approaching the age of puberty, or those over the age of puberty, were prevalent among the ancient Greeks. And the practice was actually viewed as a rite of passage for the young boys. Typically, the older man was the one that would initiate this relationship with a boy. And these relationships were not just about the physical acts, but they were also considered a form of mentorship and civic duty. Number 10 leads us to the thumb screws. In medieval Europe, the thumb screws, sometimes referred to as pillowinks, emerged as a merciless torture device designed to inflict excruciating pain. These instruments were employed to crush the thumbs, fingers, and even the toes of the unfortunate victims. Placed within the contraption, the thumb, fingers, or the toes were subjected to immense pressure as screws were gradually tightened, causing pulverization. Now, in certain instances, the crushing bars were equipped with spikes, intensifying the agony inflicted on the individual. Interestingly though, during the Renaissance era in England, these devices were repurposed to straighten and elongate a woman's fingers in an effort to achieve an appearance of elegance. That's an very interesting way to repurpose a torture device. Moving on to number 9, we have the SCOLD'S bridle. In the 16th century, both Scotland and England employed a device called the SCOLD'S bridle to punish women who were accused of being witches, shrews, or scolds. Its purpose was to publicly shame them. So how it worked is that this contraption consisted of an iron mask that was connected to a helmet. And then the woman's head would be secured with this apparatus, and a bridle bit measuring about 2 inches long and 1 inch wide, studded with spikes, by the way, would be inserted into her mouth. And as you could imagine, as a result of this, she would be unable to speak or even move her tongue without experiencing some intense pain. Coming down to the number 8 spot, we have the tongue terror. Ouch, like just saying that word, like I could feel the pain of it all. The tongue terror, which resembled an oversized pair of scissors, served as a chilling tool during darker times in history. Its purpose was to effortlessly sever the tongue of its unfortunate victims, and the process began by using a device known as a mouth opener to forcibly pry open the victim's mouth. And once this was achieved, the iron-made tongue terror would come into play, firmly clasping on the individual's tongue with its rough grippers. Now, from there, very uncomfortably twitching the tortured person's tongue was the subsequent step. And then finally, with the screw tightened, the tongue would be brutally torn away, inflicting great pain on the victim. Ouch. Number 7, here we have the lead sprinkler. The lead sprinkler was a merciless instrument of torment, and it stands among the cruelest devices conceived to inflict intense pain on a human being. Typically filled with molten lead, though other substances like tar, boiling oil, or scalding water were employed, this device operated at high temperatures, capable of severely scorching the skin. The unfortunate victim would be subjected to torture by having the scorching contents dripping onto their stomach or other vulnerable body parts, including the eyes. Now, in some cases, even molten silver would be poured onto a victim's eye, yielding, of course, devastatingly fatal consequences. The knee splitter comes next at the number 6 spot. In the grim era of the 12th century Inquisition, a device known as the knee splitters found use. Consisting of 2 wooden blocks adorned with spikes, the severity of the punishment inflicted by this contraption was actually determined by the gravity of the individual's crime. So the number of spikes ranged from 3 to 20, and each of them served as a menacing implement to drive into the flesh of the victim. Once these spikes had become embedded in the victim's leg, the blocks would be gradually brought closer together through the manipulation of 2 substantial screws. Now, the intent was to gradually pulverize the knee, mirroring the distressing name, right? That is just, wow. Mind blown. Coming up at number 5, we have the HERETIC'S fork. The HERETIC'S fork stands as a chilling metal contraption characterized by 2 bi-pronged forks affixed to a belt that encircled the neck of the victim. Now, this device featured one fork directed towards the chin, while the other pointed towards the sternum. To amplify the torment, the victim would be suspended, unable to rest or find any relief. The threat of excruciating pain loomed constantly, as any lapse in vigilance would result in the prongs piercing their throat and chest. Now, similarly, the neck could also be targeted, utilizing a metal or wooden device embedded with spikes encircling the victim's neck. Now, this apparatus effectively curtailed basic activities such as eating, lying down, or engaging in any normal function. The next device is the scavenger's daughter. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the scavenger's daughter emerged as a tool employed against Protestants who were accused of treason. The device consisted of an iron hoop, and its cruel mechanics unfolded as the victim was compelled to perch upon half of the hoop. Now the other half, controlled by a screw, would progressively constrict, and that would forcibly contort the individual into an unbending crouch. The relentless tightening of the hinge positioned at the center of the apparatus had dire consequences, ultimately resulting in the fracturing of the victim's ribs and breastbone, as well as the dislocation of their spine. Now the infliction extended beyond these agonizing injuries, with bleeding often occurring from the fingertips and even the face. Coming up at the number 3 spot, let's talk about the rack. In various forms such as horses, the infamous instrument of torment known as the rack found widespread usage throughout Europe. The essence of the device involved restraining the victim while a mechanical apparatus tightened the ropes, inflicting excruciating pain as the joints were dislocated. Now the horse, for instance, involved suspending the victim atop a beam resembling an equestrian position, with pulleys beneath that would further constrict the ropes. Now similarly, in the case of the strappado employed in Palestine, there was no supportive base for the body to rest upon. Instead, the prisoners' bound arms would be forcibly yanked out of their socket by the act of hanging. Coming down to the number 2 spot, this leads us to the PEAR of anguish. Now the PEAR of anguish was a metal tool primarily used particularly on women. Now it took various forms and could be inserted into the female private part or the mouth or the throat, and it resembled a pear in shape, and this device featured 4 adjustable leaves that were manipulated by a screw located at the top. Now it was employed in cases involving accusations of witchcraft, having a miscarriage, homosexuality, adultery, blasphemy, as well as other perceived transgressions, primarily against women. Now, tragically, its purpose was to forcibly expand the opening of her lady bits, resulting in the tearing of muscles, causing severe and permanent internal damage. In certain instances, it was also utilized to dislocate or fracture jawbones. Coming down to the number 1 spot, we have the Judas cradle. Now the Judas cradle consisted of a steel collar affixed to the victim's waist with a pyramid-shaped apparatus that was forcibly inserted into the victim's body hole, whichever one. Now the pressure exerted by this, of course, inflicted excruciating pain, and the one inflicting the punishment had the capability to raise and lower the victim using a system of ropes and pulleys, intensifying the penetration of the device and amplifying the suffering. These sessions often persisted for several days, subjecting the victim to prolonged torment. Additionally, it's worth noting that the device was rarely cleaned, and this resulted in potentially life-threatening infections. Number 10, we start off with Elizabeth I. According to Nick Hazelwood in his book, The Queen's Slave Trader, in 1564, the Tudor Queen granted a significant royal vessel to the slave trader John Hawkins in return for a portion of the profits from his voyage. And during the expedition, Hawkins captured numerous individuals of African descent and confiscated an additional 600 individuals from Portuguese ships. Coming up at the number 9 spot, we have Charles I. Back in 1632, the king issued a monopoly license to the re-established Guinea Company, allowing them exclusive rights to transport enslaved individuals. This marked the establishment of the English colonies, where the economies relied on the labor exploitation of enslaved people. First of these colonies was Barbados, often referred to as the first Black Slave Society, which was established in 1636. Coming in at the number 8 spot, we have Charles II. After the restoration of the monarchy in England, the first king established a state-sponsored enterprise by investing in a slave trading business known as the Company of Royal Adventurers of England Trading into Africa. The king granted the company a royal charter, effectively making the slave trade an official supported endeavor. And when the Company of Royal Adventurers of England Trading into Africa was dissolved in 1672, the king shifted his support to the Royal African Company. Now, this new company became instrumental in transporting a significant number of enslaved individuals from Africa to the Americas, surpassing all of the other organizations in the transatlantic trade in terms of the volume of enslaved people transported. In at the number 7 spot, we have James I. The initial Stuart monarch granted a monopoly to merchants with royal connections, enabling them to control trade with Africa. These merchants established the Guinea Company, which played a crucial role in supplying enslaved individuals for English-owned tobacco plantations in Virginia, America. Now, this information is detailed in Peter Fryer's book known as Staying Power. Moving on now to number 6, here we have James II. During his reign, James held the position of governor in the Royal African Company and was acknowledged for his extraordinary services with a reward of 500 guineas in 1677. As king, he held the largest share in the company until he sold his shares following his deposition during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. According to historian K.G. Davies in his book, The Royal African Company, James earned £6,210 from his investment. And by conservative estimates, that amount would be equivalent to about £1 million in today's economy. Moving on to number 5, here we have Queen Anne. Queen Anne is notable for overseeing the Union of England and Scotland in 1707, resulting in the formation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. However, her legacy also includes a significant expansion of England's involvement in the slave trade. When we look back to 1713, she secured the Asiento de Negros from Spain, granting England a monopoly on supplying enslaved African people to Spain's colonies in South America. The responsibility of fulfilling this contract was entrusted to the South Sea Company. Coming down into the number 4 spot, here we have George I. George I, in addition to being king, served as the governor of the South Sea Company and held a significant number of shares within the company also. While much attention is often given to the infamous South Sea bubble and the subsequent collapse of the company's share prices in 1720, the nature of his business is often overlooked. So let's take a look. The company was granted the lucrative Asiento contract, which involved supplying 4,800 healthy adult males to the colonies in Latin America on an annual basis. According to John Carswell's book, The South Sea Bubble, it was calculated that despite the share price collapse, the king managed to generate a substantial profit from his investment into the company. The king at number 3 is George II. Similar to his predecessor, George II held the positions of governor and shareholder in the South Sea Company. And during the period of 1714 to 1740, the company was involved in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved people. According to the Slave Voyages database, which has compiled extensive records on this trade, the South Sea Company transported a total of 41,923 African captives on its ships. Tragically, over 7,000 individuals lost their lives during these voyages. Moving on to number 2, this king is George III. Now, George III, despite writing an essay during his teenage years that argued against the moral basis of slavery, ultimately supported the continuation of the slave trade and slavery in general. Contrary to the notion that he was opposed to slavery, research conducted by historian Brooke Newman for her forthcoming book, The Queen's Silence, reveals that George III not only opposed the abolition movement, but also worked against it behind the scenes. While the essay may suggest a temporary sentiment against slavery, George III's actions and positions later in life demonstrate his support for the institution. Coming down to the number 1 spot in this episode, we have William IV. William IV, who was king at the time of the abolition of slavery in 1833, had always been an opponent of abolition. Prior to ascending the throne, he held the title of Duke of Clarence, and he spent a lot of time in the Caribbean where he formed friendships with plantation owners, and one incident he even boasted about contracting a disease through intimate acts that he would perform down there. Either way, he used his position to defend slavery through speeches in the House of Lords, asserting that it was crucial for prosperity and asserting that enslaved individuals were relatively content in their circumstances. It's worth noting that the Clarence House, the current residence of King Charles III and Queen Consort Camilla, was originally built for William IV in the late 1820s. With number 10, fathers could actually sell their sons. The Roman Empire was built on the labor of slaves who had no rights and they lived in horrible conditions. But surprisingly, there was one exception to this rule. Roman fathers could actually temporarily sell their sons into slavery, with the buyer agreeing on a price and duration. And then, if the son was returned in the same condition at the end of the term, everything was fine. However, if a father sold his son 3 times, well then he was considered unfit, and any son sold 3 times was legally emancipated. This whole 3 sale rule applied to each child, so a father could actually keep making money by simply having more children to sell. Number 9 leads us to the hair dye of adult workers. The Roman obsession with social standing extended even to physical appearance. In ancient Rome, native women typically had dark hair, while blonde hair was associated with Gauls and barbarians. Now, adult work was legal, but lower class adult workers were stigmatized. And to prevent any confusion between respectable Roman women and adult workers, a law required that the adult workers dye their hair blonde. But this backfired when noble Roman women began to envy the look and started dyeing their own hair or demanding blonde wigs be made from the hair of adult workers. And this led to widespread head shaving. Number 8 leads us to the public toilets. Although the Romans were often regarded as clean people, their public toilets would not meet today's standards. Rome had more than 140 communal public toilets that served as socializing spaces for people while they attended to their needs. While these toilets were connected to impressive sewage systems, archaeologists have actually discovered evidence suggesting that they were potential biohazards. These toilets were rarely cleaned, and archaeological evidence shows that they were infested with parasites such as fleas, lice, roundworms, and cockroaches. Coming up at the number 7 spot, the color purple. Did you know that wearing purple was off limits for most free Romans? Yeah, so back in ancient Rome, purple was a symbol of power as well as glory and royalty. So only the emperor and other high-ranking officials were actually permitted to wear purple togas. This was because purple dye was very expensive to produce, requiring 10,000 mollusks to make enough dye for just one toga. As a result, purple dye was worth its weight in gold, and laws were put in place to ensure that lower class Romans couldn't actually go and flaunt their wealth. Number 6, fathers could actually end lives. So let's explain. Early Roman society was deeply patriarchal, with men having complete control over their family members. This meant that a father even had the power to take the lives of his own children if he felt it was necessary. And for daughters, even after leaving home and getting married, their father could still have them eliminated. Sons only gained true independence after being sold 3 times or after their father had passed away. And these extreme rules were eventually relaxed with the abolition of a man's right to take the life of his family in the 1st century BC. Number 5 leads us to the ultimate punishment in Rome. The Romans had a multitude of brutal ways to execute criminals and prisoners. Their methods were very cruel and merciless. However, the most horrifying method was reserved for those who committed the ultimate crime of patricide, taking the life of their own father. So whoever did that was first blindfolded, next they were beaten with rods before being bound and stuffed into a leather sack. Along with the perpetrator, the sack contained a snake, a dog, an ape, and a rooster, which were thrown into the nearest large body of water. There was also some interesting rules for adultery. Roman society had different rules depending on whether the husband or wife was caught cheating. For husbands, they had considerable freedom to have mistresses and visit brothels without any real judgment, as long as it wasn't excessive though. However, wives caught in the act of adultery faced severe consequences, and the husband was required to lock the wife and the alleged person that they cheated with in a room, and they had 20 hours to then go and gather witnesses. Then the husband had 3 days to gather evidence about the affair, including its duration, location, and the lover's identity. Upon obtaining enough evidence, the husband was obligated to divorce his wife, and failure to divorce one's adulterous spouse would actually result in the charge of pimping. So if the husband desired revenge, he could end the life of the lover only if the lover was a slave or an adult worker who had no rights in Roman society. However, if the lover was a citizen, the husband had to involve his father-in-law, who had the authority to take the life of his daughter's lover regardless of his social status. The father might also even decide to end the life of his own daughter in that circumstance. Next up at number 3, let's talk about the views on other faiths. Although being invaded by the Romans was not an ideal situation, they were relatively tolerant of indigenous belief systems and often assimilated them into their own religions. However, the Jews and early Christians were a different story. One of the reasons for this was that certain Jewish and Christian practices were considered gross by the Romans. Like the Jewish practice of circumcision was very offensive to the Romans, who viewed it as a barbaric form of genital mutilation. And then when it came to certain early Christian groups, they were initially seen as a member of a cannibalistic blood cult by the Romans. They did not really understand the metaphorical meaning behind the body of Christ and the blood of Christ, eating and drinking it, you know, the stuff that happens during Holy Communion. Yeah, they took it literally. Coming up at number 2, there were body parts used in medicine. Roman doctors believed that consuming gladiator body parts could treat various ailments, with blood and liver being particularly effective against epilepsy. When the gladiator games were banned in 400 AD, the Romans turned to the blood of executed criminals for their remedies. But it doesn't end there. This fascination with gladiator parts extended to Roman beauty treatments. Dead skin cells of gladiators scraped from their baths were used in face creams also. Yeah, interesting. And finally, we end this episode off at number 1. Urine was actually very valuable. The Romans were known for their use of public toilets, and with so much waste being produced, the Romans had to develop innovative methods for disposal. Urine became such a valuable resource that Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79 AD, even implemented a tax on it. But when his son Titus objected to the disgusting nature of the tax, Vespasian, he famously asked him to smell a gold coin and then asked if it stank. When Titus replied in the negative, Vespasian, he said, "Yet it comes from urine."